Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the London Open Day of the CEU Executive MBA. My name is Thomas Lammel. I'm the Senior Program Manager of the CEU Executive MBA, and I will guide you through this evening. We will start with the program presentation. You will have the opportunity to talk to alumni and current participants, and then we will go on with the research presentation by Faculty Co-Director Professor Yusaf Akbar. First, I want to talk about the program itself, its philosophy, and practical information about the nature of the program. You don't have to go very far these days to encounter that we are witnessing fundamental transformations in the world in a century, more or less. In 2008, we had a big financial crisis. In 2015, we've experienced a large refugee crisis. And right now, we are experiencing the biggest pandemic in a century. These changes are part of a much broader set of transformation that is taking place. Some are positive and some are pretty dangerous, to be honest. So the key question is, how do we as business professionals prepare for this challenging and unpredictable environment? The obvious question is an MBA the way to do it? We have seen an explosion of online education in the last year. And I'll show you why we believe our MBA is worth it. If you're interested in further education, you usually start searching for an MBA in the city you live in. What you tend to find is mostly a pretty standard so-called vanilla MBA curriculum. Faculty who are delivering the program are pretty local. The number of international students is relatively low. Some programs in Western Europe can be quite expensive, and a local program allows you not to leave your job. If you contrast this with the top business schools in the world, they often have a very differentiated curriculum, a very mission-driven approach. They offer a certain expertise and perspective. Because of their full-time format, the student body is relatively international. And you're leaving the labor market for 1 or even 2 years, which is another financial burden. These programs are rather expensive at more than 120,000 euros. And you may have to move your family to the MBA location where you pursue higher education. So what we do at CEU is to offer the best of 2 worlds. There is no work interruption, thanks to the practical and flexible modular format. I will talk about it later in detail. The EMBA is mission-driven. Also, I will talk about the Executive MBA for the open world philosophy later. With an international student body because of the modularity of the program. According to the Times Higher Education, we are the 2nd most international university. So participants can fly in and fly out, which is a major advantage of the program. And when we say world-class faculty, we really mean it. So soon after joining the program, you'll have an important course on data-driven executive decision-making. Meet your professor, Claudia Steinwelder, who has just moved to CEU from MIT Sloan School and before taught at Harvard Business School. The follow-up course on big data and artificial intelligence will be taught by Professor Miklos Koren, one of the leading scholars in the field in Europe, with a Harvard PhD. For innovation, you'll have Mike Labelle, who holds a prestigious EU Jean Monnet chair. For leadership, Austin, our world-class psychologist with executive education experience on 4 continents. He will lead the way. If you're new to finance, Joy is a uniquely gifted educator. Generation after generation of our students tell us how she's just unique in explaining complex financial concepts. And if you're already experienced in finance, you'll be placed in the advanced track course with Adam Zawodowski, a leading expert on complex investments with a PhD from Princeton. So we have visiting faculty, experts from around the world. We have Christian Zelos from Stanford University. We have Miklos Savary from Columbia University, Professor Omar Hernandez from Berkeley, and Professor Hui Chen from Zurich, which will teach you in your modules as well. Speaking of the modules, here is what the program looks like. It's a 9-module program, as you can see. The dates you see on the screen are not going to change. So you can basically plan your studying around professional and family activities based on these dates. We are piggybacking around popular European holidays like November 1st or August 15th, when it's easier for you to take time off and commute to the modules. In the summers, our bespoke and cutting-edge leadership program takes place in Budapest, and you'll have the opportunity to benefit from electives from faculty in the world we invite to teach your classes. There will come the day when you finish with us and join the CEU alumni network from around the world. As I said, CEU is the second most international university, and you can rely on an active elite network on every continent. We have city-level chapters, country-level chapters. Basically, wherever you are in the world, you'll find CEU alumni to interact with, to mingle, and to network with. This network is a network you can count on, and one of the key assets that we have. One of our alumni is part of this open day tonight. The question is, how are we able to offer such a high-quality program at only 25,000 euros? The answer lies in our founder and benefactor, George Soros, who created CEU with the mission to promote open society. Just recently, George Soros made a further contribution to CEU's mission by offering another $1 billion, billion with a B, in endowment to create the Open Society University Network, which means we are the best endowed university in Europe. So what does the EMBA for the open world mean? First of all, when we talk about the open world, we mean skepticism towards dogmas, hierarchies, and privileges, both in context of how we teach, but also in composition of the cohort. Diversity is key to creating a successful program and is not a buzzword or an empty catchphrase for us. Secondly, we believe in debate and radical thinking, radical rational thinking. Every idea can be challenged. We believe in facts and arguments rather than narratives and fake news. Narratives create polarization in our societies nowadays, and we believe the best way to challenge this narrative-based discourse is to make arguments based on facts and realities, which is the hallmark of Karl Popper's definition of open societies. We are fundamentally opposed to all kinds of discrimination, and we actively promote diversity within our program. The way we finance the scholarship means we create opportunities for people who traditionally have not been able to actually join the program. And we see managers not just as people who deal with business or resources, but we also believe that managers go beyond that. They are positive change agents wherever they are, where in whatever industry they are, in whatever position they are. So what does the CEU Executive MBA classroom look like? Currently, we have 65 managers with an average of 14 years of work experience, including a minimum of 3 years of leadership experience. As you can see from the image in the background, we use state-of-the-art classroom technology and setups in order to facilitate discussion and interaction, which is very important for us. We make use of case-based learning rather than traditional lectures that you'll find in local MBA programs. And we want to take you, experts in your specific field, from this level of functional expertise to the strategic level. Tuition is, as I already mentioned, 25,000 euros for the whole program and includes all the credits. In order to defray your other costs like traveling and accommodation, we have special rates at partner hotels and discounts for flights with Lufthansa and Austrian. We negotiated special discounts for our EMBA participants. So we invite you to join the open world. The application deadline is June 6th. I strongly encourage you to apply as soon as possible because we have a first come, first served policy in place. You're invited to book an individual one-on-one in consultation with me to discuss your questions and optimize your applications. I will add the link to the booking system in the chat later. Speaking of the chat room, you're more than welcome to shoot in your questions in the chat, and I will collect them for the Q&A session afterwards. But it's one thing to hear about the program from us, from the program managers, and it's another thing to hear about the program from people who've actually done the program. I would like to move on to our alumni who are present, and it's Francesco della Rotonda and Selina Chu, who are, we're very honored that you're here tonight. Maybe you can introduce yourself, tell us, why you chose CEU back then, and where you are right now, how it helped your career, and tell us about the alumni network. There's so many topics we could talk about, basically. Francesco is business diagnostic lead at Simmons & Simmons, and Selina is head of strategy and operations with Android partnerships at Google. So I would say ladies first, Selina.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you for having me as well. Happy to talk about my experience. So it's been a while since I studied at CEU for my MBA, but I have really good memories and actually really good experience from it. I got a lot out of it. So first, how I got to CEU. So I think some of the things have been mentioned already. It was kind of mid-level career. Then the question comes like, are you going to do an MBA, where, etc. So I started researching, and I think one of the things that was mentioned that I thought was very appealing is obviously like the kind of lower cost compared to some of the other MBAs, which is very appealing. But at the same time, you don't want to compromise over quality. So I did some research. I worked back then in Google as well, talked to some of the recruiters. They are quite, back then, they were quite particular about kind of which universities they like to hire from. And it turned out that CEU was one of the preferred universities. So obviously that gave me a lot of confidence that this is perceived as a good education. And some of the things that really appealed to me as well were kind of the focus on emerging markets. So something that I benefit from a lot in my role, not just looking at Western Europe, but also kind of having really good understanding, like when I talk about things like affordability in Africa or regulatory pieces in Russia, for example. So that has benefited me a lot. And I think back then, I'm not sure if the same, but I also liked there was a strong focus on technology. So a lot of things that I was able to actually apply in a technology company as well that I benefited a lot from. So these were some of the things that that made me help my decision, but also that I really benefited from. And going back then to work life after the MBA, I went back to Google, which sounds easy, but it's not. You have to start from scratch. You have to prove yourself again. You don't have an easy in, even though you've worked there before. But I was really able to pivot from a more operational role into more kind of strategy direction, which I wanted, and which the MBA really helped me to achieve. And also Professor Yusaf Akbar, who was on the call, gave me a reference, so that was also very helpful. So in my current role, it's very diverse. Look at highly ambiguous problems. Looking, for example, at deal structuring, or like kind of how do we do go-to-market strategy in different regions. So things like kind of having financial confidence, which I didn't have before, legal acumen, so you can actually engage with contracts, give feedback, strategic framework. So how do we do certain things? How do we think about, how do we solve certain problems? So these are all things that I did not have in my toolkit before. And has really benefited me very much. So let me pause there, and I hope that's helpful to give some of my motivations.
You mentioned the relatively low tuition cost, which is currently now 25,000 euro. And just to be clear to the audience, there is a reason behind that low tuition, because as I've already mentioned, we have this financial endowment of another $1 billion, and we're passing on this financial advantage to our participants. We do not want to price people out of the program who are coming from countries or industries with a lower income. That's why we have this competitive lower cost for tuition. Thank you very much, Selina. I would like to ask Francesco, Now, about the alumni network, how approachable it is, and about the background that you have.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So actually, it's hard to find new things after what the guys have said, because it's been touched every yeah, but it's all true. Actually, it's good to see that actually everyone is experiencing the same things, because it means that the education and the way CEU is structured is still there after years and years and years. I did it my MBA, my EMBA, almost more than 10 years ago, actually. So it's been a long time. And regarding the network, yeah, that's one of the absolutely the highlights of the MBA. And it's not just because you meet people from different kind of walks of life, but also because I remember myself, actually, I did business with people in my class when I was doing my EMBA. And after that, as of today, we're still in touch. And it's not just about the professional networking, but it's also about the personal networking. So you have friends, that people are there for you in case you need, or and vice versa. So my background is, I studied law, so I have a master's in law. And after a few years working as a project manager, I was looking for for my next step. And when I decided to do an MBA, of course, I did my research, and my eyes were drawn to the big names like the INSEAD, Bocconi, ESAD in Europe, right? I was working and living in Budapest at that time. And, but then doing my research, I came across CEU. I was like, oh, okay, it might be that I have the business school at my doorstep. So let me have a look at it. And then when I looked at the program, the world-class professors, and the diversity, there were three things I was looking for, and the flexibility, because obviously I wanted to keep working to basically pay off my my MBA. I was like, okay, that's bingo for me, because it's right here, right now. It's amazing value for money, and I can't highlight that enough. It's really like, I would say it's best investment I've ever done in my life. And I'll tell you why as well, because and linking to my career. Because it's so one thing I would say that it's my personal takeaway from my experience there, which I will keep for life, I believe, is the critical thinking, is the thinking with different viewpoints when you do something, and that thinking out of the box that helps you in any situation. And towards the end of the EMBA, actually, I managed to secure a place into a leadership program with one of the leaders telco companies in the world, BT, and I completely kind of changed my career path. So I was project manager for many years, and then I moved into more change management, business strategy, and I've been doing this for the last 10 plus years now. First for BT for many years, I've been managing projects globally, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the UK, in Europe, everywhere. Then I moved to banking, so completely different sector. So I worked for Barclays for a few years, and now I work for an international law firm. Why I'm saying this, not because I want to show off, but because the education that you will get at CEU, it gives you that kind of spectrum, that kind of it's wide, and your brain is trained to basically go through everything, and you can change sector, you can change business, you can go from profit to no profit, but the approach you have to things is the same, and the critical thinking I was mentioning. So I guess it's I can recommend more than what I'm doing. It's been great.
The essence that I heard from both of you, and I'm happy that I've heard it, to be honest, is that we were able to help you advance from the operational level of expertise to the more strategic level. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And if I can add, on one of your slides, Thomas, there was, is it still worth doing an MBA? Absolutely. It is worth, it is valued. When I recruit, I see people, if obviously I have two candidates and one has the MBA and another doesn't, I usually try to go to the one, because of the mindset and the thinking that actually these type of programs give you. So I highly recommend, and again, there's no better deal in Europe, I guess, probably in the world, than CEU.
And you've mentioned the alumni network before. I mean, just to illustrate to the audience here what the alumni network refers to, we have an alumni network of more than 18,000 professionals all around the world in basically all countries, with major hubs in all cities, in all countries. And this alumni network is approachable. I mean, just for an example, I didn't know you, Selina and Francesco, before, and I just approached you, I think it was via LinkedIn or email, asking you if you would be willing to join this open day without knowing you before. And you were right away. I didn't need to convince you or persuade you to join tonight. And I think this shows how approachable, how easy this network is for everybody who's in that network. And you can mingle, you can make new friends, you can network. It's up to you what you make of that network.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Francesco and Selina. We're moving on to the research presentation. I'm passing on the baton to Professor Yusaf Akbar. I would like to introduce him to you. Professor Yusaf Akbar is Faculty Co-Director of the CEU Executive MBA and Associate Professor of Strategy. He has published over 40 journal articles, 4 books, and numerous contributions to academic and professional research in strategy and international business. He's the founding editor of the International Journal of Emerging Markets and an advisor to governmental authorities. And his consulting and professional references include Citibank, Deutsche Telekom, Siemens, Texas Instruments, and Toyota, among others. And I'm really looking forward to his research presentation on Globetrotter Entrepreneurs. Yusuf, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I just realized inadvertently CEU faculty have the same uniform. Check the photos. That was unexpected. We should coordinate next time, Maciej. Let's make sure we at least have something slightly different to wear. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I'd like to spend a few minutes with you sharing the findings of a research study we're just finishing up with colleagues in Russia, Austria, and one of my current doctoral supervisees. And essentially what we're looking at is trying to explain the methods and processes used by entrepreneurial firms in their international expansion. What I'll do is I'll give you a very quick kind of rundown of some of the main concepts we look at when we think about international market entry and trying to understand, how firms internationalize and so on. And then I'll get into the theoretical heart of our research project, which is looking at 2 dueling theories for understanding how entrepreneurs expand internationally. I'll then introduce you to the empirical study that we've chosen, which is a South African emerging market multinational, which is the largest retail services company on earth. I'll say more about that industry in just a moment because you've probably never heard of it before, but it's kind of important. We'll talk about some of the methodology that we used. I won't get too much into the weeds, but a little bit of explanation is needed to sort of clarify. I'll give you some of the results from our study, maybe sort of, provide some implications, and then I'm going to be grilled alive by my colleague Maciej in the Q&A. So, if you look at the literature on international market entry theory, there are essentially 3 dominant paradigms. One is the so-called transaction cost economics paradigm, which essentially says internationalization of firms. By that, what we mean is when a company, instead of producing at home and exporting abroad, decides to actually produce in another country to sell in that country or neighboring countries, is that they're doing that because essentially they're trying to overcome transaction costs. And this is the so-called make or buy question. And for a very long time, until I would say, the last couple of decades, that was quite an important and dominant stream of the literature. I think what's happened, of course, with this kind of semi-globalization world that we're now in, the make or buy decision has actually been reversed, and maybe that's something we can come back to later on. Another theme in the literature is the so-called resource-based view, which essentially says you internationalize your activities because as a company, you possess resources and capabilities which are rare and hard to copy and which give you a competitive edge in foreign markets, right? So the obvious examples of this would be things like intellectual property, right? You've got a patent and you know there's a market for this patented product or service that you offer, and therefore you expand into foreign markets, knowing that for a given period of time, parenthesis China, you're able to actually leverage your intellectual property and gain a competitive advantage over your rivals. And then the third approach was an attempt by the late John Dunning, a very important writer and thinker from the University of Reading, developed this thing called the ownership location internalization paradigm, which is essentially what we call an eclectic theory. So what it tries to do is it essentially tries to combine both aspects of transaction cost economics, make or buy decision, resource-based view, which is looking at sort of rare and hard to copy resources and capabilities. And then the last piece is the kind of competitive strategy perspective, which is, the choice of markets and how we position ourselves in those markets. So that's just a little bit of the background to our research. So essentially, there are two diametrically opposed views about how particularly small and mid-sized firms internationalize. And I think this is important to understand that, that much of the research until about, let's say, the turn of the century, focused on larger multinational firms, the blue chip companies that are listed on stock exchanges worldwide, the household names and brands. Now, our alumna, Selina, works for a company, of course, that pretty much threw all of that idea out the window as a so-called born global, right? So this was a tech startup that internationalized at a pace which was historically unprecedented. And I'm not actually going to get into that category of entrepreneurial firms, the so-called born globals, largely because they reside in what you might call fairly, they're huge industries, don't get me wrong, but they reside within digital sectors. And, it's fairly obvious that digital growth internationally is probably easier than trying to develop a supply chain of complex manufacturing products, right? Andras and Roger and Selina and Francesco are experiencing the joys of Brexit now, where they go into their supermarket and their favorite burrata is not readily available because it's sitting in a truck at the French border, right? So what I'm going to focus on in the research here are these kinds of companies, right? So companies that are actually having to provide physical goods or in-market services. And I think that's an important difference, right? Because the born globals obviously have to invest in market for regulatory purposes, language changes, and so forth, but they're still fundamentally a digital firm, right? So the first approach to the expansion of entrepreneurial firms is this idea of causation. And there are essentially kind of three elements of causation, which I think are important for our purposes here this evening. The first is that entrepreneurs are strategic planners, right? So what they actually do is they come up with an explicit, written down game plan about how they're going to internationalize, right? And so the key questions that they focus on are should type questions. What should I do in this particular market? And measures of performance are traditional measures of strategic performance, expected return on investment. They do formal competitive analysis, right? So that's one side of the debate, causation. And before I move on, in terms of my work, I've generally looked at entrepreneurial firms in my previous research very much through this lens of causation, largely because my kind of intellectual upbringing has been to kind of encourage that kind of approach, transaction cost economics, resource-based view, and so on. Now, the exact opposite view is a view held by, I think, a distinct literature, which is different from this causation literature, and this is called the effectuation literature. And basically what the effectuation scholars say, and Saraswati, an Indian scholar, is particularly important in this field. She's made the most important contributions in the field. They essentially say the exact opposite to causation. They say that, in fact, entrepreneurs expand internationally through experimentation and testing, right? So rather than having a grand plan of how they intend to grow, they basically seek out new markets through experimental and testing. And the questions they ask are not quote unquote objective questions. They're more subjective questions. Who am I as an entrepreneur? what do I know? Who do I know? So these kinds of relational factors are as important as these kinds of objective, what should I do type questions. And rather than focusing on sort of traditional so-called rational measures of performance, entrepreneurs focus on things like affordable loss, contingencies, and rather than trying to plan everything, they see surprises as opportunities. So I've got a couple of sort of quotes, if you like, about this approach. Sarasvati said in 2001 that effectuation is a non-predictive entrepreneurial approach to internationalization. And she built upon that in a paper some years later. She said internationalization is considered as a byproduct. So focus on that, a byproduct of entrepreneurs leveraging their extant networks to move their ventures forward. Yeah. So the causation literature says, this is a plan. You see you have these advantages, you go abroad to leverage them. You see it makes sense to produce overseas because it's cheaper because of transaction costs and so on. And what the effectuation literature is saying is the exact opposite. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, okay, fine. So let's kind of see, which of these two tendencies makes sense when we examine the internationalization processes of small and mid-sized firms. And of course, what you do with these kinds of research projects is you go into the literature, and I've just pulled out, I think, 4 studies which have looked at this question, right? Crick and Crick 2014 said, they looked at UK high-tech ventures and their internationalization. They said it's a combination of both causation and effectuation-based thinking affecting the planning, which shaped a number of firms' internationalization strategies. Kalinic in the same year looked at manufacturing SMEs, and they said unplanned internationalization can still involve logical decisions. Entrepreneurs tend to follow an effectual rather than a causal logic. Chetty, a year later, said SMEs tend to employ causation logics in foreign market selection, but later on exploit effectuation during foreign market entry. And we've got some interesting emerging evidence about this claim, actually, in our findings. And in 2012, a set of German SMEs were studied by Harms and Sheila, and they found that expert entrepreneurs tend to use the logic of effectuation in their internationalization process. So you can see already among the literature, there's a degree of debate around which is the one that really matters. So let's kind of move into the empirical context here. So how are we going to explore this idea? And so what we decided to do is we decided to look at a single firm for our study. And it's a company called Smollen Group. They're a South African-based emerging market multinational. They employ 79,000 people all over the world, offering retail solutions. Now, what are retail solutions? The next time you go into a supermarket in London, if they're open, I'm not sure if they're open. Yeah, they must be open. You have to be able to buy food in London, even despite the lockdown, right? The next time you go into a supermarket, you actually look quite healthy, so I guess you are eating. So the next time you go into a supermarket and you see those self-checkout systems, what Smollen does is Smollen configures those systems by working with software suppliers, hardware providers, and the retail chain itself. That's one thing, which is what we call sales execution. Other things they do is they work with brand owners to develop engaging ways of displaying products and services. So the next time you go into, a drugstore, again in London, Superdrug or something like that, you might see, the new latest Gillette razor with 17 blades, right? That costs £30,000 a blade. That layout will be designed by Smollen Group. And of course, in recent years, and now an acceleration because of the pandemic, Smollen Group is now moving aggressively into e-commerce solutions as well, and trying to build capacity in data analytics to help their clients better understand the behavior of their customers. They're active in 60 countries on all continents in the world aside from North America, because they formed a joint venture with America's largest retail solutions company called Advantage. And basically they agreed that, we'll stay out of America if you stay out of our market spaces. I'm not alleging illegal behavior here. That's not illegal to make those kinds of judgments. They're a multi-generational family business, which I think is very interesting. I think it's now the third generation of the company. And they basically describe themselves as the pivot point where the retailer, brand owner, and shopper intersect. I think that's a very nice way of describing what they do. They're absolutely a hidden force in the industry because most of us as shoppers focus on the retailer's brand and on the product and service brands that are offered by the retailer. We take for granted the stuff that goes on in the background, which is exactly what Smollen Group does. And we also think that Smollen Group's interesting because you see they started out in Africa. That was their first core market, which is an emerging market, institutionally weak. You know, a lot of the rules and practices are not very well established. So our initial feeling when we started this study was that perhaps what we may find is an emerging market multinational like Smollen might use effectuation techniques more than causation techniques. So I think that was our starting point. So now let me tell you a little bit about the sample that we used. We collected two types of data. We had a series of semi-structured interviews with the senior management team of the company. So the interviews were conducted with 3 chief executives responsible for the regions of Asia, Pacific, Europe, Middle East, South Asia. And we also interviewed the chief growth and innovation officer, who's one of the family members of the company, who is currently number 2 within the organization. His brother is the CEO. And based on these interviews, we developed a survey instrument, which we distributed to managers of Smollen Group all around the world. You can see the countries listed there. It's quite a broad group of countries, so it kind of captures a flavor of both developed markets and emerging markets. And we got a pretty good response rate, 55%, which gave us enough data to do something slightly analytical with that. Now, who were the respondents to our questionnaire? The average age of the participants was 40 years. The range was 27 to 53, 2 female, 16 male respondents. Their professional experience ranged quite substantially, 4 years to 30 years, and we had an average of 17 years professional experience. And half of the participants, and we think this is also important when we think about effectuation processes, is half of the participants had some entrepreneurial experience with an average of about 7 years, right? And more than 60% of the managers at Smollen had some prior international experience with an average of about 5 years, ranging from 1 year to 16 years. So it's quite a diverse sample we have here. Now, we didn't use a regression analysis, partly because we didn't have enough observations to do traditional multi-level linear regression or logic regression or hierarchical regression. So we use this thing called fuzzy set analysis. And what you do in fuzzy set analysis is you have an output variable, right? And our output variable was an attitudinal measure of a firm's performance at a new foreign market, which we then checked with data on sales growth, market share growth, and profit growth, which was supplied to us by Smollen Group. And we had 2 key input variables: effectuation practices, and we borrowed Chandler's 2011 construct, which is experimentation, flexibility, affordable loss, and local partnerships. And then we had a single construct for causation, which was, again, an attitudinal set of questions around planning. Of course, we also had some context variables. So we looked at psychic distance, which measures the difference between home market and foreign market to see if that had an influence. We looked at the international experience of the managers and the entrepreneurial experience of the managers as control variables. So very briefly, because I don't want to turn this into a methodology presentation, regression analysis is one of the most common methods that are used to look at relationships among variables, right? So with regression, we can help predict causal correlations between independent and dependent variables. What fuzzy set analysis does is it takes us a step further. It provides an alternative to regression analysis when looking to identify cause and effect processes. So the literature on this suggests that fuzzy set analysis may actually be better for doing theory building, because it doesn't just look at single relationships between one variable and another. It identifies combinations of causal conditions that lead to an outcome. And I think that's important when I present the results. Now, we looked at two market entry modes, non-joint venture and joint venture, right? So remember, a joint venture is a legal construction of a new company with shared equity between the company wishing to sell in the foreign market and typically a local firm who has expertise in the market, right? And so in the fuzzy set analysis, this produces two solutions. Solution one is non-joint venture, solution two is joint venture, and produces 4 fuzzy set configurations. So what we see here in the output table for fuzzy set analysis is you see various conditions. So when you see a large black dot, that means that the analysis shows that this is a core condition which explains causality. Where you see a circle with an X through it, that means it's not relevant. And where you see a small dot, it's not core to explaining, but it has a role in explaining. And when it's a small circle with an X, it's a lack of peripheral conditions. So if you take a quick look here, so this is joint venture, sorry, this is joint venture, this is non-joint venture. What you can see here is that local partnerships play a key role in explaining how SMEs internationalize. But I think what's also very interesting is if you look at configuration 2, you see a combination of both causation practices and effectuation practices in the data, right? Now you can see some overall numbers here. The first is the solution coverage, right? And what that means is it represents how many cases with the outcome are represented by a particular causal condition. So that's 59% of the sample can be explained by our various configurations. And solution consistency represents the extent to which a causal combination leads to an outcome. And here, of course, you can see we've got a very good result. 96% of the output can be explained. So what are the key findings here? As I just mentioned before, local partnership is key, irrespective of entry mode, joint venture versus non-joint venture. Affordable loss plays a role in all configurations, which suggests that effectuation processes are at work. 3 of the 4 configurations display a role for entrepreneurial flexibility, again, supporting our 2011 construct of effectuation. But causation decision-making logic is used concurrently with effectuation in 3 of the 4 configurations. And causation plays a much more important role in joint venture entry modes, which is solution 2. And this is a kind of intuitive finding, right? Because by its very nature, the joint venture process is more planned and structured, frequently necessitating ex ante agreements on cooperation. What are the limitations of our study? QCA, fuzzy set analysis, only helps with finding combinations of antecedent conditions that correlate with performance of the internationalizing firm. So they're not as targeted as regression analysis. And of course, you need to take our results with a pinch of salt that we looked at a single company, which was a service industry emerging market multinational. So moving forward, and I think we'll probably end up doing this partially ourselves, we could do some experimental work with managers, sort of getting to see, give them problem solving situations and see which methods they use to solve the problems. And I think we could probably do a longitudinal research study too, so examining maybe a smaller group over a longer period of time to see if we can get more precise behaviors. That's my presentation. I'll hand over back to Thomas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yusuf.
Do we have questions from the audience?
Yes. Yusuf, do international companies use transfer pricing to get competitive advantage over competitors?
Well, transfer pricing, of course, is a very particular practice used by large multinationals, and transfer pricing is essentially used to move tax liabilities around the world. So, you're going to invoice markets where taxation is high to reduce your profitability in that market, and you're going to be doing the opposite in markets where there's low taxation so you can retain as much of the revenue as possible. I don't know about the specific transfer pricing practices of Smolland, so I can't speak specifically to this case, but we know there's a very common practice in international firms, particularly larger ones.
And what are the barriers to entering new markets? Are there invisible walls?
Invisible walls. I guess I'd need some more clarity on what an invisible wall is. You can, I think, theoretically, you can think about how different industry structures dictate barriers to entry, which is the typical kind of Porter strategy analysis. So, you can look at service industries, and in service industries, particularly international service provision, you have a lot of in-market regulatory differences. I mean, part of the reason why British companies like Andras's company are going to really struggle in the EU after Brexit is because, of course, Britain has now decided to untether itself from EU standards, which means that there may be, I don't know, Andras knows the specifics of his particular industry, but like there's probably going to have to be there's going to be a problem here because Britain may not be operating to the same standards as a European service provider, and that creates a barrier, right? So in service industries, technical standards. So you can look at sort of things like, you have to use certain components in a particular product, and the standard, the obvious one are the plugs. The British with their bizarre 3-pin plug, which doesn't seem to serve any purpose other than making things heavier. You've got the American dangerous one with the thin metal where you can get electrocuted if you're not careful. And you've got the European standard, which would, like with most things European, is somewhere in the middle. So you've got technical standards, and you've got fiscal standards, right? So you can look at the way in which economic production is treated differently by taxation authorities around the world. That's very important. You think about Switzerland versus the rest of the European Union. You can have things like local content requirements. So, for example, a government may require a foreign firm to produce X% of the so-called value added in market, and so on. So there's a plethora of barriers to entry in international market entry, very closely related to market structure and so on.
What about language and culture?
But yes, I mean, that's exactly what I wanted. The course, which is called mysteriously the non-market strategy, which is a combination of a little law and little political economy and a little public policy applied to some international relations, applied to strategic context and relevant for businesses. And one thing that you can totally see on top of the formal differences that you mentioned, Yusaf, are those invisible ones, such as the growing tacit protectionism that even sort of most advanced and seemingly open economies develop, which demonstrates itself every time when you face a civil servant or a bureaucrat with discretion. Yes, if the law is very infrequently clear and unambiguous, and when it is ambiguous, what is the law? The law is what the so-called guys with guns say the law is, what the implementing agency or a bureaucrat making a decision on your business says it is. Yeah. And in those situations, the invisible preferences against the others and for, buy USA or made in China, I mean, it's becoming more and more similar. And those barriers may be more important than the formal ones, precisely because they're invisible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great point, Maciej, as ever. I mean, I think we capture part of what you're saying here in psychic distance, which measures the cultural, administrative, political, and social differences between markets. So you can see in our results, they play a peripheral role in explaining what's going on in 3 of the 4 configurations. But I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that in this world of semi-globalization, you know, if you remember 15 years ago, Maciej, it was all about globalization, everything. Globalize your grandmother if you can get away with it, right? And I think in today's world, we've seen a significant response to that. And so we're in this very odd semi-globalization world. And I think, you know, the Economist, about just after Trump gets elected, the Economist has an editorial where they talk about islandization of the world economy, you know, where essentially increasing protectionism, as you've referred to correctly, sort of breaks down the ability of firms to create these global networks, and that the cost of global networks goes up. So you as a company, you have to find other ways of arbitrage across regulatory systems. There's some very interesting work that's just been published a year or so ago on the splinternet, you know, that essentially what's happening is that, you know, China is developing its own regulatory system for the internet. Europe with GDPR is creating significant new barriers to entry for non-EU compliant firms. And the US is doing some of its own things. Selena, I'm sure, can speak to this very, very clearly from Google. So I think I agree with you completely. And I think that, and this is a gentle hint to you, given your expertise, a study that actually, I think, examines the impact of semi-globalization could actually be super, super interesting. And I think a very important contribution to the literature.
Yes, that is indeed a nudge. And another question. In all survey research, we face the famous bias called social desirability bias, which is people tend to respond how they think they are supposed to respond. You are a uniquely positioned person to answer this question because you've taught executives in what, 40 countries plus. So in your view, because there can be two options here. If I am asked if I have a plan or I am experimenting, I can see two stories going on with a biased response. On one hand, I may try to show that I'm in control and put a nice narrative, coming back to Thomas's point, to connect all the dots that happened in my company or in my professional history to make a nice story. That would increase the perception of the causality, of the causation part, as opposed to reality. But I can also, especially nowadays, see also the opposite story, in which you try to communicate you are flexible, you are, adjusting to this world, you are open-minded, and you are not kind of bureaucratic in your managerial decisions, in which case the effectuation part may actually be more socially desirable. What do you think? Do you think that the biases cancel out, or what do you see teaching executive is hotter today, the plan or the agile?
Well, let me speak specifically to this sample that we looked at, small and group, because the point you raise is really nice. When we interviewed the senior managers, it was all about causation, strategic plan, vision. This is how we do it. It's magic. And when we spoke to the country managers, we got different responses. We got much more operational and tactical behaviors, which I think are closer to effectuation behaviors rather than causation. So I think, seniority in an organization and perceived authority may drive you in a certain direction. That may be one explanation. I think our industry is partially contributing to this debate. I think that right now,
exactly, put MBA degree as an independent variable, as a control variable.
Exactly. Yes. Well, and also, like, right now everything's about agility, right? And maybe because we're constantly force feeding our MBAs with this concept of agility, maybe they go around talking about that all the time because they think that their bosses like to hear it, and they say, oh, that's why we invested in you to go do an MBA. So there may be something around that as well.
Yeah, I do believe that the times have changed. In
Yeah.
this sense. There is a question from Moja Bank. Do you see?
Does Small and Co. believe that South Africa is ready for global standard when it comes to service delivery?
So, so both the CEO and the Chief Innovation Officer are both MBA graduates. So this comes back to Maciej's argument that he made earlier, David and Michael Smollen. And they talk about glocal, right? So they talk about having a global brand, Smollen Group, but everything, you know, all markets are local. So there is no global standard for retail services, because if you're selling fast-moving consumer goods like shampoos and stuff like that in sub-Saharan Africa, in semi-urban environments, the way you lay out a store is a completely different process for when you're helping brand owners in tier 1 cities of China in state-of-the-art shopping malls, right? So if Smollen, I think if the Smollen guys were in this meeting tonight, I think what they would tell you is that the global standard is the brand, is the integrity, is the ethics of the company, and the focus on people in the company. You know, we can take that with a pinch of salt, but from what I've seen of the company, actually, I do think they believe that. And I've seen some evidence of that. But I think in terms of service delivery, market by market, everything is local.
And
okay, let me, we have one additional question from the participant, and then if Selina, Rosa, Francesco, or Andras have any questions, you can jump in. But I guess then Thomas will tell us to stop talking about internationalization and start answering questions about the program. But I think there is a very good question from Peter, which is kind of what I often, as Yusaf knows, I have strong views about. So, what are the? Peter is asking about the factors that affect entrepreneurial success. Yes, what does it take for them to become billionaires, so to say? And as you say, as you know, it's kind of an interesting debate. What is?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Peter. I mean, look, the kinds of entrepreneurs that I do most of my research with are not likely to become billionaires because they run small, mid-sized firms. You know, maybe the company gets to $1 billion in revenue, but that won't necessarily translate into the owners being billionaires. And I think the concept of an entrepreneur is a very broad idea, because there are entrepreneurs and there are entrepreneurs, very different kinds of behaviors. So you can contrast, you know, Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs that create these multi-billion, almost trillion-dollar enterprises. And then you can think about entrepreneurial family businesses like Illy Coffee, which produces 350 to 400 million euros a year. So I don't think we can say there's a single set of behaviors that explain entrepreneurial behavior. I actually think it's a very complex, multifaceted thing. And there's a lot of contextual factors which explain it as well.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we should proceed now to the general Q&A questions, because I noted a couple of questions from the audience. I will ping pong the questions to you, Yusaf and Maciej. The first question for Yusaf is about, are there any exams? How are the modules assessed, and is there a thesis?
In reverse order, no thesis. We're an American MBA program, so we don't do thesis, but what we do is a capstone project, which is a kind of a cumulative portfolio of important learning experiences during the program. It can include, a particular presentation that you gave during the program. It can be a particular assignment you were asked to do. It can also involve mentoring opportunities, because one of the things that we do at the EMBA is we give an opportunity to the participants to mentor CEU pre-experienced students. We have a program called Boost, which is a pre-experience strategy and management program, and we link up our EMBAs with the mentors. So that's the first question, no thesis. Every module has a pre-course activity and a post-course activity, and that varies depending on the subject matter. If you're doing more hard subjects like finance and data, it may involve more traditional examination methodologies. If you're doing a more soft subject, quote unquote, like leadership, it may be something different. But one of the most important things, and I think this is something that we emphasize greatly, is that when you're with us during the module, we don't give you exams or tests, because what we want you to do is we want you to focus on the learning among yourselves and with the faculty. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks. Maciej, the next question is for you. Why did you decide on a modular format, and what advantages or disadvantages does it bring?
Yes, the excellent question. For many years, we had a weekend format, and we realized that what the mission of the university is, which is to be accessible to leaders of tomorrow, people from broad range of backgrounds, but also be very international. It's just very difficult to achieve in a weekend format. It's just impossible to imagine a significant group of our executive fellows flying from another location every second or third weekend for 2 years. So we really were looking at how we can deliver the same experience, maybe even better experience, with a format that will both allow you to continue with your professional life and travel to the module, participate in the module. We would never go into kind of online education sphere, because that's not what CEU is about. CEU has one of the lowest so-called student-faculty ratio in Europe, the ratio of how many students per one professor, 7:1. It's very, very low. And the whole idea is to create a community that can interact. Yes. So that brought us to the modular format, which gives you that. It's this immersive morning to evening experience. Every hour counts. Every hour is planned weeks in advance, it's, as you know, the short module is convenient during the hectic year, just 3.5 days. The long module, Saturday to Sunday, 9 days. Usually the week includes a popular European holiday like May 1st. Is sufficient that you can kind of get this important campus experience that you mentioned, Thomas, which is a hallmark of any good US style education, not only MBA. Yes, that there is this certain campus atmosphere that surrounds you, and you can't do it. You can't get into this mode in just 1 day. Yes, but 9 days is kind of very, very practical. You can start having a sense of it, having a feel of it, while it's still doable in terms of just clearing out your schedule. So that's the background, and we are really amazed with the with how candidates respond to that. We have candidates joining us from East Coast of United States, from Central Asia, from the Gulf, from India, in the upcoming class that some of you may be also applying for. So this really shows that format, that idea really clicks with.
Thank you very much, Maciej. The next question is for Yusaf on COVID measures / online education. Are we pursuing online education? If not, why not?
So, as Maciej said before, one of the main benefits of doing an MBA is the ability to network with your fellow participants, which is much more difficult to do on Zoom. I do find it quite funny when some quite well-known business schools on LinkedIn are advertising virtual networking. I'm not quite sure how that works, but maybe my teenage son, who's an online gamer, can tell me about virtual networking. So, we use online where we're forced to, frankly. We much prefer to have a physical learning experience. And as for COVID-19, we strictly adhere to all national public health measures that are enforced in the two countries where we have campuses, Vienna and Budapest. But we definitely prefer an in-class, non-virtual learning experience, but we will use the technology where we need to. We've actually been doing a fair amount of hybrid since the pandemic began. So for those people that can actually get physically to our campuses, using suitable and safe physical distancing protocols, we can run classes that way. But we have state-of-the-art classrooms with fantastic media and communications technologies, which enables folks online to be in the classroom with their fellow participants who are physically in the room. So in sum, we use technology to enhance the learning experience, but we are not an online program, and we don't intend to be.
Mm-hmm. You addressed the COVID measures. I want to go in detail here. We did antigen tests even last year when it was not industry standard. We were among the first institutions who did antigen tests among all participants. Participants were only allowed to enter the campus with a negative test, of course. And on campus, all of our participants are required to physically distance in class and wear masks, and we are providing hand sanitizers for everybody. So this is on the COVID measures. Maciej, can you please talk about the application process?
Yes. So the application process is straightforward but competitive. So take it seriously. When, for example, when it asks for the cover letter, really make a case, not only why you need the degree, but what you can contribute to the learning experience. And why is it so important to put all those, the CV, the references? Because some of you may already know that we don't use this horrible standardized tests like GMATs or, I mean, this would be, we do the language test if you are not a native speaker or didn't graduate from an English language institution, but we don't do the GRE or GMAT. We find this test very weakly correlated with anything that we see as particularly important in a class. The creative thinking, the kind of co-producing behavior, generous to your fellow executives, the interesting perspective that you bring, that those tests don't measure it. So because they don't measure it, and we still want a very high quality class, we need to make extra effort to actually replace them somehow. So the paperwork you submit is very carefully reviewed by a multi-person team in the admissions office. And then if you pass that stage, you are invited for almost an hour of interview with a senior faculty member on the program who is going to have a very strict protocol asking you certain questions that are important to us, and that's going to be evaluated. Interestingly enough, the final decisions based on all those components are actually not even made by the admission committee. CEU Executive MBA is the only program at CEU where final admission decisions are made by our president, Michael Ignatieff, at the moment. It's not that he has too much time on his hand, but it's because this program, it's very important for CEU, for this program to have this kind of perfect, well-balanced, well-rounded class. We are not a mass-producing factory that can produce 800 MBAs a year. We have just one cohort. We want to connect you with top faculty across the university. When you learn about the, decision making for your leadership program, that the head of our Europe-renowned cognitive studies department will deliver this. Christoph will deliver this session, and so on. So we have just one cohort, and we want to build a unique, truly life-changing experience for everybody involved. And that's what we are looking for. It doesn't take ages. It takes 2-3 weeks, probably, start to finish. We work efficiently, but you need to put an effort into it.
Thank you very much. Yusaf, how does a university that is accredited both in the US and the EU help me in a career transformation? Can you talk about the leadership transformation, please?
Yeah, so, accreditation of a degree both in North America and Europe gives you a competitive edge over other MBAs, in the sense that, you might have a European accredited, but not North American, or North American, not European. So I think that's a major benefit. But the CEU leadership program, which is our kind of signature leadership activity, which takes place each summer in August, we believe to be a fundamental feature of the learning experience and the transfer of very valuable competencies. There are 3 modules. The first year, it's called Good Decisions. Maciej referred to Christoph Heinz, who's a cognitive scientist, who's one of the contributors to that module. The second module is called Good Culture, where we focus on leadership within an organizational context. And then the third module in the final year is when we focus on Good Life, which looks at things such as work-life balance. And so, that's part of the leadership transformation that we're seeking to achieve, not just from the operational and tactical to the strategic level, but also in a much more broader kind of cognitive and psychological sense.
Thank you very much. So if there are any other questions, I would like to conclude the sessions. It's 8:30. I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. Selina, Andras, Rosa, and Francesco, and the 2 faculty co-directors. And thank you for the audience, for the attendees for coming tonight. Let's keep in touch, and thank you very much.
Thank you all to all participants. It was great.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Bye.